The morning of September 13, 1942, Lieutenant Hans Weber of the 24th Panzer Division crouched behind the twisted remains of a Soviet T-34 tank, its turret blown clean off by an 88mm round from his unit's Panzer IV. The metal was still warm to the touch, smoke rising from the engine compartment as Wehrmacht engineers moved forward to clear the street of debris. Around him, the rubble-strewn approaches to Factory District stretched toward the Volga River, where Soviet positions clung to the western bank like barnacles on a ship's hull. Weber adjusted his field glasses, scanning the maze of destroyed apartment blocks and factory buildings that had become the Sixth Army's latest objective. 3 months of fighting had reduced Stalingrad to a moonscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. Yet Soviet resistance had only intensified as German forces pushed deeper into the city. The sound of machine gun fire echoed constantly from the direction of the tractor factory, where elements of the 14th Panzer Division were attempting to establish footholds among the industrial machinery. Behind Weber, Oberstfreiter Klaus Hoffmann of the Reconnaissance Battalion checked his equipment for the third time that morning. His MP-40 submachine gun was loaded with a fresh magazine, 2 stick grenades hung from his belt, and a canvas bag contained additional ammunition for the unit's MG-42 machine gun. The 21-year-old veteran of the French campaign had learned to prepare meticulously for urban combat operations, where a single oversight could prove fatal in the maze of Stalingrad's ruins. "Herr Lieutenant," Hoffmann called softly, pointing toward movement in a partially collapsed building 200 meters ahead. Soviet infantry, approximately squad strength, occupying defensive positions on the second floor. Weber nodded, studying the target through his binoculars. The building had been a department store before the German bombardment, its ground floor now completely gutted, while the upper floors provided excellent observation over the German advance routes. Soviet snipers had been using similar positions throughout Factory District, picking off Wehrmacht soldiers with deadly precision from concealed firing positions. The lieutenant reached for his radio handset, calling for artillery support from the 71st Infantry Division's forward observers. "Fox Control, this is Panzer 77. Request fire mission, coordinates 475 to 832. Suspected enemy strong point, over." The response crackled through static-filled speakers as Soviet jamming equipment interfered with German communications. Panzer 77, Fox Control. Unable to provide immediate support. All available artillery is engaged against enemy positions in the grain elevator sector. Suggest you coordinate with local assault guns. Over. Weber cursed under his breath, recognizing the reality that had plagued German operations in Stalingrad for weeks. The Sixth Army's artillery resources were stretched impossibly thin across a front that now extended deep into the city's urban landscape. Every building became a fortress, every street corner a potential killing ground, requiring enormous expenditures of ammunition and manpower to secure objectives that offered minimal strategic value. The sound of approaching tank engines drew Weber's attention to the rear, where 3 Panzer IVs from the 14th Panzer Division were moving forward in single-file formation. The lead tank, commanded by Oberfeldwebel Ernst Bahr, bore the tactical markings of the 1st Company and showed extensive battle damage from previous urban fighting. Welded steel plates reinforced the turret front, while spare track links draped the hull sides provided additional protection against Soviet anti-tank rifles. Bahr's tank halted beside Weber's position, the commander emerging from his turret hatch to coordinate the next phase of the advance. His face showed the strain of continuous combat operations, with dark circles under his eyes and the 1,000-yard stare common among Wehrmacht veterans who had fought through the suburbs of Stalingrad since late August. The regimental command post reports that elements of the 295th Infantry Division have secured the southern approach to the tractor factory, Bahr announced, his voice barely audible over the constant background noise of artillery explosions and small arms fire. "Our orders are to advance northwest along Factory Street and establish observation positions overlooking the Volga riverbank." Weber studied his tactical map, noting the complexity of the operation Bahr described. Factory Street ran directly through the most heavily fortified section of Soviet defenses, where the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov had concentrated anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine gun nests in mutually supporting positions. Previous German attempts to advance along this route had resulted in heavy casualties for minimal territorial gains. "What about the Sturmgeschütz battalion?" Weber asked, referring to the self-propelled assault guns that provided close infantry support during urban operations. "Are they available for direct fire support against defensive positions?" Barr shook his head grimly. "The assault gun battalion is committed to operations in the Central District, supporting the 76th Infantry Division's attack on the railway station. We're on our own for this 1 inch. The reality of German force distribution in Stalingrad had become increasingly problematic by September 1942. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, was attempting to control operations across a battle zone that extended for over 30 kilometers along the Volga River, while maintaining defensive positions protecting the Army's extended flanks along the Don River bend. Individual units found themselves conducting independent operations with minimal support from adjacent formations. At 0800 hours, Weber's reconnaissance patrol began its advance toward the tractor factory complex. The unit moved in standard urban warfare formation, with scout teams providing forward security while the main body advanced by bounds between covered positions. Soviet snipers immediately engaged the German infantry from concealed positions among the factory ruins, forcing the patrol to seek cover behind demolished walls and abandoned vehicles. The first casualty came within minutes of beginning the advance. Gefreiter Müller, a veteran of the Polish campaign, took a sniper's bullet through the chest while crossing an exposed section of Factory Street. The high-velocity round from a Soviet Mosin-Nagant rifle punched through his field uniform and lodged in his spine, paralyzing him instantly. 2 medics from the regimental aid station rushed forward under covering fire, but Müller died before they could evacuate him to the rear medical facility. Weber radioed the casualty report to battalion headquarters, adding another name to the growing list of 24th Panzer Division personnel killed or wounded in Stalingrad operations. The division had suffered over 40% casualties since entering the city, with replacement personnel arriving from training depots in Germany having little experience in urban combat operations. By mid-morning, the German reconnaissance patrol had advanced approximately 400 meters through the industrial complex, establishing temporary observation positions among the ruins of factory buildings that had once produced tractors for Soviet collective farms. The machinery had been evacuated eastward across the Volga before German forces reached the area, leaving only empty concrete shells that provided excellent defensive positions for both sides. Through his field glasses, Weber could observe Soviet positions on the eastern bank of the Volga River, where supply boats continued delivering ammunition and reinforcements to the defenders despite German artillery fire. The river crossing presented a target-rich environment for German observers, but requests for concentrated artillery fire were consistently denied due to ammunition shortages and competing demands from other sectors. "Herr Lieutenant," Oberstfreiter Hoffmann whispered, pointing toward movement in a collapsed building complex 150 meters northeast of their position. Soviet infantry, at least company strength, moving toward the grain elevator sector. Weber focused his binoculars on the area Hoffmann indicated, observing approximately 100 Soviet soldiers moving tactically through the ruins in small groups. The infantry carried a mix of weapons including PPSH-41 submachine guns, Mosin-Nagant rifles, and several light machine guns that would significantly enhance defensive capabilities in the positions they were obviously moving to occupy. The lieutenant faced a tactical dilemma that had become commonplace during Stalingrad operations. His reconnaissance patrol lacked the firepower to engage a Soviet company, but allowing the enemy infantry to reach their objective would complicate future German operations in the sector. Radio communications with higher headquarters remained sporadic due to Soviet jamming and the physical obstacles presented by urban terrain. Weber decided to request immediate support from the Panzer IVs that had accompanied his patrol, hoping that direct tank fire could disrupt the Soviet movement before it reached its objective. He signaled Oberfeldwebel Barst tank, using hand signals to indicate the target location and request engagement with high-explosive shells. The lead Panzer IV traversed its turret toward the indicated target area, the 75mm KWK-40L/43 gun elevating slightly to clear intervening obstacles. Barr had loaded high-explosive rounds specifically for engaging infantry targets in urban terrain, understanding that armor-piercing ammunition was largely ineffective against dispersed personnel targets. The first round detonated among the ruins where Soviet infantry had been observed, sending clouds of dust and debris skyward as fragments scoured the area with deadly effect. Weber observed through his binoculars as several Soviet soldiers were knocked down by the explosion, while others sought cover among more substantial ruins that offered protection from further tank fire. Return fire came immediately from multiple Soviet positions. Anti-tank rifles opened fire from concealed positions among the factory ruins, their 145mm rounds striking sparks from the German tank's armor without penetrating but creating tremendous noise and psychological pressure on the crew. Simultaneously, Soviet mortars began dropping rounds in the vicinity of Weber's observation position, forcing the reconnaissance patrol to seek better cover. The engagement continued for 20 minutes before Soviet forces withdrew deeper into the urban maze, having achieved their apparent objective of reaching prepared defensive positions while inflicting casualties on German forces. Weber's patrol had suffered 2 additional wounded, including Oberstfreiter Hoffmann, who took shrapnel in his left arm from a mortar round that detonated against a nearby wall. As German medics treated the wounded, Weber reflected on the tactical lessons emerging from urban combat in Stalingrad. Traditional Wehrmacht advantages in mobility, coordination, and combined arms operations were largely negated by terrain that channeled movement along predictable routes while providing unlimited defensive positions for determined infantry. Every advance required enormous expenditures of ammunition and manpower for minimal territorial gains. The afternoon of September 13th brought new orders from division headquarters, directing Weber's unit to conduct reconnaissance operations in support of a major assault scheduled for the following morning. Elements of the 295th Infantry Division would attack Soviet positions in the grain elevator sector, while the 24th Panzer Division provided armored support and secured the northern flank against counterattacks. Weber studied the operational plan with growing concern about its feasibility given available resources. The attack would require coordination between multiple units across terrain that severely limited communications and observation, while Soviet defenders had demonstrated remarkable ability to conduct effective defense from prepared positions among the urban ruins. Oberfeldwebel Bar approached Weber's position as the lieutenant completed his tactical analysis. The tank commander's uniform showed fresh tears from shrapnel, and his face displayed the exhaustion common among Wehrmacht personnel who had been fighting continuously since the offensive began. "The supply situation is becoming critical," Barr reported quietly, ensuring that his comments wouldn't be overheard by the enlisted personnel. "Fuel consumption is running twice the normal rate due to urban terrain, and ammunition expenditure is far exceeding resupply capabilities. My tank has less than half a load of main gun rounds remaining." Weber nodded, recognizing that Barr was articulating concerns shared throughout the Sixth Army. The logistical demands of urban warfare had proven far greater than German planners had anticipated, while the extended supply lines from rear depots made timely resupply increasingly difficult. Soviet air attacks against German supply columns were becoming more frequent and effective, further complicating the situation. "What's the word from regimental headquarters about reinforcements?" Weber asked, hoping for information about additional units being committed to Stalingrad operations. Barr's expression darkened. "The 16th Panzer Division is being transferred from Army Group Center, but they won't arrive for at least 2 weeks. Until then, we continue operations with existing forces." The prospect of continuing intensive urban combat for another 2 weeks with depleted units and limited supplies added to Weber's growing doubts about the Stalingrad operation's ultimate success. German forces had been fighting in the city for nearly a month without achieving decisive results, while Soviet resistance appeared to be strengthening rather than weakening under pressure. As evening approached on September 13th, Weber's reconnaissance patrol established defensive positions among the ruins they had occupied during the day's operations. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine called for withdrawal to more secure positions during hours of darkness, but the tactical situation in Stalingrad made such movement extremely hazardous due to Soviet infiltration tactics and the complex urban terrain. The patrol's defensive preparations included positioning machine gun teams to cover likely approach routes, establishing observation posts with overlapping fields of fire, and preparing demolition charges that could seal key passages if Soviet forces attempted to overrun their positions. These measures reflected hard-won lessons from previous night operations in Stalingrad, where German units had suffered heavy casualties from surprise Soviet attacks. Soviet harassing fire continued throughout the night, with snipers taking carefully aimed shots at any German movement, while mortar teams dropped occasional rounds into areas where Wehrmacht personnel might be concentrated. The psychological effect of constant threat was cumulative, preventing meaningful rest and contributing to the combat fatigue that was becoming endemic among German units. Weber found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, instead studying intelligence reports and tactical maps by the dim light of a shielded flashlight. The reports painted a disturbing picture of Soviet capabilities that seemed to be growing rather than diminishing under German pressure. New units were being identified regularly, while captured equipment suggested that Soviet forces were receiving substantial reinforcements and supplies despite German efforts to interdict river crossings. Dawn on September 14th brought renewed German offensive operations as elements of the 295th Infantry Division began their assault on the grain elevator complex. Weber's reconnaissance patrol was ordered to advance northeast along Factory Street in support of the main attack, providing flank security and intelligence on Soviet defensive positions. The advance began at 0600 hours following a 30-minute artillery preparation that expended virtually the entire daily ammunition allocation for the supporting artillery battalion. German 105mm and 150mm howitzers concentrated their fire on known Soviet positions, creating massive clouds of dust and debris that temporarily obscured observation across the battlefield. Weber's patrol moved forward cautiously through the artillery impact area, observing the effects of the bombardment on Soviet defensive positions. While the shelling had destroyed several buildings and created additional obstacles to movement, most Soviet personnel appeared to have survived in deep shelters and basement positions that offered protection from all but direct hits by heavy-caliber rounds. The first indication of continued Soviet resistance came from machine gun fire that engaged the German patrol from multiple directions simultaneously. MG-42 machine guns from the 295th Infantry Division responded with suppressive fire, their distinctive high cyclic rate creating the sound that Soviet soldiers had nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw. By 0730 hours, German forces had advanced approximately 200 meters into the grain elevator complex before encountering organized Soviet defensive positions that brought the attack to a complete halt. Anti-tank guns positioned among the ruins engaged German armor at point-blank range, while Soviet infantry used the urban terrain to conduct close-range assaults with submachine guns and hand grenades. Weber observed the engagement from a forward observation position, noting the tactical sophistication of Soviet defensive operations. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions against superior German firepower, Soviet forces conducted a mobile defense that utilized the urban terrain to maximum advantage while inflicting maximum casualties on attacking forces. The breakthrough moment came when Oberfeldwebel Panzer IV managed to punch through a Soviet defensive line, creating a gap that German infantry could exploit. The tank commander had identified a weakness in the Soviet position where destroyed buildings created a corridor that allowed his vehicle to approach undetected and engage anti-tank guns from their flank. German infantry immediately poured through the gap, led by assault teams armed with flamethrowers and demolition charges specifically designed for urban warfare. These specialized units had received additional training in clearing fortified buildings, though their effectiveness was limited by ammunition shortages and the enormous physical demands of urban combat. By midday on September 14th, German forces had secured approximately half of the grain elevator complex, though Soviet forces continued to hold positions throughout the area from which they could conduct harassing attacks. Weber's reconnaissance patrol established observation positions that provided excellent views of Soviet supply activities along the Volga River bank, confirming continued reinforcement and resupply operations despite German artillery fire. The tactical situation that emerged from the day's fighting illustrated the fundamental problems facing German forces in Stalingrad. While individual objectives could be captured through the application of overwhelming force, the enormous resource expenditure required made such operations unsustainable over the long term. Additionally, Soviet forces demonstrated remarkable ability to reoccupy positions shortly after German forces moved on to other objectives. Weber's daily situation report to battalion headquarters reflected these concerns in careful military language that avoided direct criticism of operational planning. Enemy resistance remains determined throughout assigned sector. own forces have achieved limited territorial gains at significant cost in personnel and material. Enemy reinforcement and resupply activities continue across Volga River despite interdiction efforts. The response from higher headquarters was predictably optimistic, emphasizing the strategic importance of Stalingrad operations and the necessity of continued pressure on Soviet forces. Continue aggressive operations to secure assigned objectives. Additional support will be provided as resources become available. Success of entire campaign depends on rapid conclusion of Stalingrad operations. Such communications reflected the growing disconnect between tactical reality and strategic planning that characterized German operations in Stalingrad during September 1942. While frontline units reported increasing difficulties and mounting casualties, higher headquarters continued to demand rapid success without providing additional resources or acknowledging the operational challenges involved. September 15th brought new intelligence reports that fundamentally altered Weber's understanding of the strategic situation. Soviet forces were reportedly massing for major counteroffensive operations northwest of Stalingrad, where thinly held German positions along extended flanks offered tempting targets for mobile operations by Soviet armored formations. Weber studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm, recognizing the vulnerability of German positions that had been created by the concentration of forces for urban warfare in Stalingrad. The Sixth Army's flanks were held primarily by Romanian and Italian units with limited anti-tank capabilities, while German reserves had been committed to the city fighting and were unavailable for defensive operations elsewhere. The Romanian Third Army has 6 divisions covering a front of over 100 kilometers, Weber noted to Oberstfreiter Hoffmann as they reviewed tactical maps. That's completely inadequate for defensive operations against determined Soviet attacks. Hoffmann nodded grimly, understanding the implications of German force distribution for the overall strategic situation. If the Soviets break through on the flanks, the entire Sixth Army could be cut off in Stalingrad. This conversation represented Weber's first clear articulation of what would become the central reality of the Stalingrad operation. German forces had become so focused on tactical success in urban warfare that they had lost sight of the strategic vulnerabilities created by their operational deployment. The city had become a tactical fixation that was consuming resources and attention while creating strategic dangers. The week of September 16th to 22nd brought a series of limited German advances that captured additional portions of Factory District while failing to achieve decisive results. Weber's reconnaissance patrol participated in 6 separate assault operations, each requiring enormous expenditures of ammunition and manpower for territorial gains measured in city blocks rather than strategically significant terrain features. Casualties mounted steadily during this period, with Weber's unit suffering a 60% loss rate that was typical throughout the Sixth Army. Replacement personnel arrived from training depots in Germany with minimal preparation for urban warfare, leading to additional casualties as inexperienced soldiers learned harsh lessons about survival in Stalingrad's deadly environment. The psychological effects of prolonged urban combat became increasingly evident among German personnel. Veterans who had fought successfully in Poland, France, and the early phases of Operation Barbarossa displayed symptoms of combat fatigue that reduced their effectiveness and endangered their units. Sleep deprivation, constant stress, and exposure to horrific casualties created a cumulative burden that traditional military discipline could not entirely overcome. Weber observed these effects in his own unit, noting changes in behavior and decision-making that reflected the enormous strain of continuous combat operations. Soldiers became increasingly cautious and hesitant, while others displayed reckless aggression that suggested psychological breakdown under pressure. Maintaining unit cohesion required constant attention to morale factors that had not been significant concerns during earlier campaigns. October 1st brought new orders that would commit Weber's unit to what German commanders described as the final push to secure Stalingrad. The Sixth Army would concentrate all available forces for simultaneous attacks on the tractor factory, the Red October Steel Works, and the Barricadi gun factory, the 3 major industrial complexes that remained under Soviet control. Weber studied the operational plan with professional interest, noting its similarity to previous unsuccessful operations that had consumed enormous resources without achieving decisive results. The fundamental tactical problems that had plagued German operations for months remained unresolved. Urban terrain that favored defenders, logistics difficulties that limited sustained operations, and Soviet reinforcement capabilities that replaced losses faster than German forces could inflict them. "This is our fourth, final offensive since entering the city," Oberstfreiter Hoffmann observed dryly, as he cleaned his MP-40 submachine gun in preparation for the renewed operations. "Perhaps this time will be different." Weber recognized the skepticism in Hoffmann's comment, reflecting broader doubts that had emerged throughout German units, as repeated promises of imminent victory proved unfounded. Professional soldiers who had experienced rapid success in previous campaigns were beginning to question the fundamental assumptions underlying Stalingrad operations. The October offensive began with the largest artillery preparation German forces had conducted since entering Stalingrad, concentrating virtually the entire Sixth Army's available firepower against Soviet positions in Factory District. For 2 hours, German guns of all calibers pounded suspected defensive positions while Stuka dive bombers added their contribution to the bombardment. Weber's reconnaissance patrol advanced behind the artillery barrage, observing its effects on Soviet defensive positions while identifying targets for follow-up attacks. The bombardment had created enormous destruction among the factory buildings, but Soviet personnel continued to emerge from deep shelters and basement positions that had provided protection from all but the heaviest shells. German infantry assault teams followed immediately behind the reconnaissance elements, supported by Panzer IVs and assault guns that provided direct fire support against identified defensive positions. The attack achieved initial success, penetrating several hundred meters into the factory complex before encountering organized Soviet resistance. The breakthrough came at the tractor factory, where elements of the 14th Panzer Division managed to reach the Volga River bank after a week of intensive fighting. German soldiers could observe Soviet supply boats operating on the river, confirming that Soviet forces continued to receive reinforcements and supplies despite German control of most urban areas. Weber participated in the final assault on the tractor factory's main production halls, leading his reconnaissance patrol through a maze of demolished machinery and collapsed roofing that provided countless defensive positions for determined Soviet defenders. The fighting was conducted at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, with both sides using grenades, submachine guns, and flamethrowers in close-quarters combat that tested human endurance to its limits. The factory's capture required 5 days of continuous fighting that cost the 24th Panzer Division over 200 casualties, including several experienced NCOs whose loss significantly reduced the unit's combat effectiveness. Weber himself was wounded on October 16 when a Soviet hand grenade exploded near his position, sending shrapnel into his left shoulder and rendering his arm temporarily useless. German medical facilities in Stalingrad were overwhelmed by the casualty rates generated during October operations. Field hospitals established in captured buildings lacked adequate supplies and personnel to provide proper treatment for the volume of wounded personnel, leading to conditions that would have been considered unacceptable during earlier campaigns. Weber spent 3 days in a makeshift hospital established in the basement of a destroyed department store, where German medical personnel worked by candlelight to treat wounds with inadequate supplies and primitive conditions. The experience provided sobering insight into the overall deterioration of German capabilities that was occurring as the Stalingrad operation consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. Upon returning to duty on October 20th, Weber found his unit reduced to less than 40% of authorized strength, with most surviving personnel showing signs of combat fatigue that reduced their effectiveness. Replacement personnel continued to arrive from Germany, but their lack of urban warfare experience made them more liability than asset until they gained sufficient experience to survive in Stalingrad's deadly environment. The tactical situation had stabilized somewhat following the capture of most major factory buildings, but Soviet forces continued to hold positions throughout Factory District from which they could conduct harassing attacks against German positions. Additionally, intelligence reports indicated continuing Soviet reinforcement activities that suggested no diminution in enemy capabilities. November brought the first serious indications that German operations in Stalingrad might not achieve their strategic objectives. Intelligence reports confirmed major Soviet force concentrations northwest and southeast of the city, where preparations for large-scale offensive operations were clearly underway despite German efforts to interdict Soviet movements. Weber received these intelligence summaries with growing concern about the strategic implications for German forces committed to urban fighting in Stalingrad. The Sixth Army had become so focused on tactical operations within the city that insufficient attention was being paid to the broader operational situation that was developing. The Soviets are massing at least 12 rifle divisions and 4 tank corps in the Serafimovich sector, Weber noted during a briefing with his remaining NCOs. Our positions there are held by the Romanian Third Army, which lacks adequate anti-tank capabilities. The implications were clear to professional soldiers who understood operational warfare. Soviet forces were preparing to exploit the strategic vulnerabilities created by German concentration in Stalingrad, potentially cutting off the entire Sixth Army through attacks against weak positions on extended flanks. November 19th brought the beginning of Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive that would fundamentally alter the strategic situation in southern Russia. Weber first learned of the offensive through fragmentary radio reports indicating major Soviet attacks against Romanian positions northwest of Stalingrad, though the full scope of the operation would not become clear for several days. Initial reports suggested successful Soviet penetrations of Romanian defensive lines, but such information was not uncommon given the limited capabilities of Germany's allies. Weber continued reconnaissance operations in Factory District, unaware that events occurring hundreds of kilometers away were sealing the Sixth Army's fate. The breakthrough came on November 20th when Soviet armored spearheads from the 26th Tank Corps reached the Don River crossing at Kalach, effectively cutting the Sixth Army's primary supply line and threatening complete encirclement. Radio communications from Army headquarters reflected growing concern about the strategic situation, though operational orders continued to emphasize the importance of maintaining positions within Stalingrad. Weber's first clear indication of the developing crisis came on November 22nd when his unit received orders to prepare for possible withdrawal from current positions. After months of offensive operations designed to capture additional territory, German forces were suddenly contemplating retreat from hard-won positions. Movement will be conducted only on specific orders from division headquarters, the message specified. All units will maintain current defensive positions pending further instructions. Supply operations will continue through established channels. The reference to supply operations proved to be wishful thinking. By November 23rd, Soviet forces had completed the encirclement of Stalingrad, trapping the entire Sixth Army plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army inside a pocket that extended approximately 60 kilometers from east to west and 40 kilometers from north to south. Weber studied tactical maps showing the new situation with professional fascination and personal horror. The German forces that had seemed so powerful during the advance into Stalingrad were now completely isolated from their supply bases, dependent on air transport for ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies that were essential for continued operations. Luftwaffe transport aircraft began flying supply missions into improvised airstrips within the pocket, but their cargo capacity was completely inadequate for sustaining 250,000 German and Axis personnel under combat conditions. Daily supply requirements exceeded 700 tons, while actual deliveries averaged less than 100 tons even under favorable weather conditions. The reality of encirclement became clear to Weber and his men during the first week of December, when ammunition rationing was instituted throughout the Sixth Army. Artillery fire was restricted to defensive operations only, while infantry units were limited to essential combat operations that conserved scarce ammunition stocks. Food rationing followed quickly, with German personnel receiving rations that provided less than 1,500 calories per day, insufficient for men conducting combat operations in sub-zero temperatures. The psychological effect of hunger was combined with growing doubts about the possibility of relief operations that could restore the Sixth Army's connection to main German forces. Weber observed the physical deterioration of his men with professional concern and personal anguish. Soldiers who had been healthy and vigorous during the summer offensive were becoming gaunt and listless as malnutrition and cold weather took their toll. Combat effectiveness declined rapidly as personnel lacked the physical strength necessary for demanding military operations. December 12th brought the beginning of Operation Winterstorm, General Hermann Hoth's attempt to break through Soviet encirclement and establish a relief corridor to Stalingrad. Weber monitored radio communications between the Sixth Army and the relief force with desperate hope that external rescue might resolve their increasingly desperate situation. The 57th Panzer Corps advanced to within 50 kilometers of the Stalingrad pocket before being halted by determined Soviet resistance and deteriorating weather conditions. Radio communications between General Paulus and the relief force revealed growing pessimism about the operation's ultimate success, though German forces continued to maintain defensive positions within the pocket. Weber's personal moment of realization came on December 19, when radio intercepts revealed that Operation Winter Storm had been cancelled and the relief force was withdrawing to defensive positions. The Sixth Army would remain isolated in Stalingrad, dependent on increasingly inadequate air supply while facing a Soviet army that was growing stronger rather than weaker. "Gentlemen," Weber addressed his remaining personnel that evening, "I believe we must accept that we will not be leaving Stalingrad. Our orders are to continue defensive operations, but the strategic situation suggests that relief is no longer possible." The admission represented a fundamental psychological shift that was occurring throughout German forces in the pocket. Professional soldiers who had maintained confidence in ultimate victory were beginning to acknowledge that their situation had become hopeless. Morale deteriorated rapidly as this realization spread through the ranks. Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad was observed under conditions that would have been inconceivable during the optimistic days of summer offensive operations. Weber's unit established a defensive position in the basement of a destroyed factory building, where 15 surviving personnel shared cold rations and discussed their increasingly limited options. Soviet forces had begun systematic reduction of the German pocket, conducting carefully planned attacks that captured key terrain features while minimizing their own casualties. German counterattacks were largely ineffective due to ammunition shortages, reduced personnel strength, and deteriorating physical condition of surviving soldiers. January 1943 brought renewed Soviet offensive operations designed to eliminate the Stalingrad pocket completely. Weber's unit was assigned to defensive positions in Factory District, where they faced overwhelming Soviet superiority in personnel, artillery, and supplies while receiving virtually no support from higher headquarters. The psychological breaking point came for many German soldiers during the January fighting, when it became clear that survival depended entirely on Soviet decisions about prisoner treatment rather than any possibility of military rescue. Weber observed increasing numbers of personnel who simply stopped fighting, either through deliberate surrender or psychological collapse under impossible conditions. His own decision came on January 24, when Soviet forces overran his unit's defensive position, and he found himself wounded and unable to continue resistance. Rather than face certain death from untreated injuries, Weber chose surrender to Soviet forces, joining thousands of other German prisoners who had reached similar conclusions about their hopeless situation. The march into Soviet captivity provided Weber's final perspective on the Stalingrad operation that had consumed the German Sixth Army. Looking back at the ruined city where German forces had fought for 6 months without achieving decisive results, he understood that the urban battlefield had become a strategic trap that destroyed an entire army through tactical fixation. The 91,000 German and Axis prisoners taken at Stalingrad represented the catastrophic failure of military planning that had prioritized tactical success without adequate consideration of strategic vulnerabilities. Weber's personal experience reflected the broader tragedy of professional soldiers who had executed their orders competently while serving a strategic concept that was fundamentally flawed. Years later, reflecting on his Stalingrad experience from the perspective of post-war analysis, Weber would understand the operation as representing the turning point where German military capabilities were definitively surpassed by Soviet forces that had learned to combine tactical competence with superior strategic planning. The city that was supposed to provide Germany with decisive victory instead became the graveyard of military ambitions that had exceeded rational strategic objectives. The realization that the Sixth Army would never leave Stalingrad had come gradually, through accumulated evidence that relief was impossible and continued resistance was futile. But once that realization was accepted, it provided clarity about the military situation that had been obscured by months of tactical focus on limited objectives within the urban battlefield. Weber's recognition of strategic reality came too late to influence the outcome of operations that had been doomed by fundamental flaws in German planning and execution. The tactical competence that had carried Wehrmacht forces from the Polish border to the Volga River was insufficient to overcome operational mistakes that exposed entire armies to destruction by competent opponents. The lesson of Stalingrad, as Weber understood it in captivity, was that tactical success without strategic coherence inevitably leads to operational disaster. German forces had achieved remarkable tactical victories throughout the urban fighting, capturing most of the city through the application of superior training and equipment, but these tactical successes had not produced strategic advantages that justified the enormous costs involved. Soviet forces, conversely, had accepted tactical defeats in order to achieve strategic victory by drawing German forces into an urban battle that consumed irreplaceable resources while creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited through operational-level counteroffensives. The result was complete destruction of German capabilities that could not be regenerated within the time frame required for continued strategic competition. Weber's experience in Stalingrad provided personal insight into the broader transformation of warfare that was occurring during World War II. Traditional military virtues of tactical competence and professional dedication were necessary but not sufficient for success against opponents who understood the relationship between tactical operations and strategic objectives. The German army that entered Stalingrad in August 1942 represented the culmination of professional military development that emphasized tactical excellence and operational mobility. The force that surrendered in January 1943 demonstrated the limitations of tactical focus when divorced from strategic understanding of the broader military situation. For Weber personally, Stalingrad represented the end of faith in military institutions that had shaped his professional identity and personal worldview. The realization that competent execution of assigned missions could lead to complete disaster forced fundamental reconsideration of the assumptions that had guided his military career. The city itself had become a symbol of the broader strategic failure that was consuming German military capabilities faster than they could be regenerated. Urban warfare in Stalingrad demonstrated that tactical virtuosity was meaningless when employed in service of strategic concepts that were fundamentally flawed from their inception. Weber's captivity lasted until 1948, providing years of enforced reflection on the military and political factors that had led to the Stalingrad disaster. His analysis of the operation evolved from initial focus on tactical details to broader understanding of the strategic miscalculations that had made German defeat inevitable regardless of battlefield performance. The conclusion he reached was that the Sixth Army's destruction at Stalingrad resulted from institutional failures that extended far beyond individual military competence. Strategic planning had failed to account for Soviet capabilities and responses, while operational execution had prioritized immediate tactical success over long-term strategic positioning. Most significantly, Weber recognized that the German military's professional excellence in tactical operations had become a strategic liability when it prevented recognition of fundamental problems in operational planning. The very competence that made German forces effective in specific battles had contributed to their ultimate defeat by obscuring strategic realities that required acknowledgement and adaptation. When Weber finally returned to Germany in 1948, he found a country that was struggling to understand how military forces that had seemed invincible in 1940 had suffered complete defeat by 1945. His personal experience in Stalingrad provided one perspective on the broader transformation that had occurred when German tactical excellence encountered Soviet strategic competence. The lesson of Stalingrad, as Weber understood it, was that military success requires integration of tactical competence with strategic understanding. Neither element alone is sufficient for victory against competent opponents who understand the relationship between immediate battlefield results and long-term strategic objectives. His experience also demonstrated the dangers of tactical fixation that prevents recognition of changing strategic circumstances. German forces in Stalingrad had continued executing tactical missions competently even after the strategic situation had shifted decisively against them, resulting in catastrophic losses that could have been avoided through earlier recognition of strategic realities. Weber's post-war career in civilian life was shaped by lessons learned during his military service, particularly the understanding that institutional competence in specific activities does not guarantee success in broader competitive environments. The same analytical skills that had made him an effective reconnaissance officer proved valuable in civilian occupations that required assessment of complex, changing situations. But the memory of Stalingrad remained with him throughout his post-war life, serving as a permanent reminder of the costs that result when tactical competence is divorced from strategic understanding. The realization that the Sixth Army would never leave Stalingrad had come too late to influence the outcome of operations that were doomed by fundamental strategic misconceptions. For Weber, as for thousands of other Stalingrad veterans, the experience represented both personal tragedy and professional education in the relationship between tactical operations and strategic outcomes. The city that was supposed to provide Germany with decisive victory instead became a classroom where harsh lessons were learned about the limitations of military competence when employed in service of flawed strategic concepts. The final irony, as Weber understood it years later, was that German forces in Stalingrad had performed their tactical missions with the same professional competence that had characterized their operations throughout the war. The disaster resulted not from failures in military execution, but from strategic planning that had created impossible conditions for tactical success. This understanding provided perspective on the broader tragedy of World War II, where professional military institutions on all sides were compelled to execute strategic concepts that often exceeded rational military objectives. The result was unprecedented destruction that demonstrated the dangers of tactical competence employed in service of strategic ambitions that disregarded practical limitations and human costs. Weber's experience in Stalingrad thus represented both personal tragedy and broader historical lesson about the relationship between military means and political ends. The realization that the Sixth Army would never leave Stalingrad had come through accumulated evidence that strategic objectives were unattainable regardless of tactical performance. But this realization came too late to prevent the destruction that followed from fundamental flaws in strategic planning. The city of Stalingrad itself became a symbol of the broader transformation of warfare that occurred during World War II, where tactical competence alone proved insufficient for strategic success against opponents who understood the integration of military operations with broader political and economic factors. Weber's personal experience provided one perspective on this transformation, illustrating how individual military competence could become strategically irrelevant when employed within fundamentally flawed operational concepts.